A high-stakes interview, a loaded question, and a CEO who knows the game. When Darius Bell stepped onto live TV, they thought they had him cornered. But they were about to learn. He doesn't play by their rules. She tried to discredit him on live TV. His response? It flipped the entire narrative. The email landed late in the afternoon. A crisp, formal note from the producers of The Morning Exchange, one of the country's top talk shows. They wanted Darius Bell, the tech visionary behind Innovis, as a guest for their upcoming segment on diversity in business. Darius had seen this pattern before. Mainstream media suddenly remembering black entrepreneurs, parading them around for applause before moving on to the next headline. But this time was different. Innovis wasn't some rising startup. They had just secured a multimillion-dollar defense contract, outmaneuvering industry giants. That wasn't luck. It was 20 years of relentless work. Still, he hesitated. Something felt off. His assistant, Tasha, caught the pause. "You sure about this? You know how these shows work. They love a success story until they get the chance to tear it down." Darius leaned back, exuding quiet confidence. "I'll handle it. Besides, it's national exposure. Let's see what they have to say." Tasha exhaled, shaking her head. "Just don't let them bait you." He nodded, though deep down, he knew the game. If this was a setup, they were playing chess with the wrong man. The morning of the interview, Darius arrived at KXNT Studios in LA. The green room was cool, clinical. A young producer greeted him without looking up from her clipboard. "Mr. Bell, thanks for being here. We'll mic you up in 5. No small talk. No warm-up. Just in and out, a transaction." As he settled into the makeup chair, an assistant dusted his face with detached precision. On the wall-mounted monitor, the live broadcast rolled on, a celebrity scandal panel, a cooking demo, then a transition card. Coming up next, the black tech boom, talent or special treatment. Darius clenched his jaw. So, this was their angle. If they thought they had the upper hand, they were in for a surprise. A hostile interview, a loaded accusation, and a CEO who refuses to back down. When Darius Bell took the hot seat, they expected him to fold. Instead, he turned the game on them. But he had no idea just how far they were willing to go. The set of The Morning Exchange was designed to feel warm, inviting, soft blues and golds, a sleek glass coffee table between the host and guest. But beneath the polished set design, cameras hovered like silent sentinels, capturing every movement, every flicker of expression. Darius adjusted his suit jacket as he took his seat across from Madeline Royce, the show's lead anchor, a veteran journalist with a sharp mind and an even sharper reputation. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "Darius Bell," she began, her voice smooth, rehearsed. "CEO of Innovis. A true American success story." Darius gave a polite nod. "Appreciate you having me." Madeline leaned in slightly, flipping through her cue cards. "Let's get right into it. Your company recently secured a $200 million government contract, outperforming some of the biggest names in tech. That's impressive." Darius knew this game. Build him up, make it seem like they admired his success. Then, the real questions would come. He kept his response measured. "It was a long process, but yeah, we put in the work. We developed a security encryption system that outperformed our competitors. Simple as that." Madeline crossed her legs, her expression neutral. Some have called it groundbreaking. A calculated pause. But others have raised questions. Darius didn't flinch. "There it is." She picked up a card, reading aloud. "Some industry experts claim Innovis benefited from federal diversity incentives. That companies like yours have an edge in securing these contracts because agencies are prioritizing vendor diversity. That perhaps this wasn't just about being the best, but about meeting a quota." And there it was. The real reason he was sitting here. Darius let a moment pass before responding. "I've heard that argument before. Funny, though, when a black entrepreneur wins, it's special treatment. But when legacy firms, run by the same families for generations, land these same contracts, nobody questions it." The air in the studio shifted. Off camera, producers exchanged quick glances. Madeline held her ground. So, you're saying race played no role at all in your success? Darius chuckled, shaking his head. Let me ask you this. When SpaceX won its NASA contracts, was it because Elon Musk met a diversity quota? When Jeff Bezos secured government deals for Blue Origin, was it because of his background? Or do we only ask that question when the CEO looks like me? Madeline's expression barely flickered. So you don't believe these diversity programs help? Darius folded his hands. They help level the playing field. But what people forget is, the playing field was never level to begin with. But Madeline wasn't done. Not yet. Her smile sharpened, like a blade wrapped in silk. She glanced at her cue cards, then back at him. Well, Darius, since you brought up the playing field, she said, her tone shifting, polite curiosity replaced with something colder. You grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Single mother. Public school. Worked your way up from nothing. That's inspiring. Darius gave a slow nod, already sensing where this was going. But here's what some might wonder, Madeline continued. How does someone with no Ivy League background, no deep family connections, go from a struggling neighborhood to securing contracts that billion-dollar corporations fail to land? She let the question hang, the implication clear. How did you get here? Who pulled the strings? Darius tilted his head slightly, as if considering his words. It's called work, Madeline. Some of us don't have generational wealth or country club networks to fall back on. So we build from the ground up. Madeline gave a small nod, as if acknowledging his answer. But she wasn't listening. But surely, she pressed, you had help along the way. A mentor? A program? Something that gave you an extra push. Darius exhaled quietly. Yeah. Help came in the form of working 3 jobs while getting my engineering degree. Help came in the form of sleeping in my office while I built my first software prototype, because I couldn't afford rent. That's the help I got. Her lips pressed together for just a fraction of a second. Behind the cameras, the producers were locked in. Madeline shuffled her cue cards again. And yet, she continued, her voice steady, some would argue that black entrepreneurs today have more opportunities than ever before. That programs like affirmative action, minority business grants, and government incentives exist specifically. Darius leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. You know what's funny, he said, his eyes locked onto Madeline. Whenever a black business owner succeeds, the first question is always what program helped you. But nobody ever asks which old money bank funded a white-owned startup. Nobody asks which family connections got them into Stanford or which golf buddy invested in their company. He let that sink in, the weight of his words filling the silence. The truth is, success isn't handed out in some lottery, he continued. People like me, we have to be twice as good just to get a seat at the table. A shift in the air. The tension wasn't just on the set anymore. It was in the audience, in the control room. The quiet realization that this wasn't just another segment. This was something real. But Madeline, she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a slow, practiced smile. The kind a chess player gives when they think they've just trapped their opponent. That's an interesting perspective, she said, voice smooth as glass. But let's talk about another factor, perception. She turned slightly toward the cameras, angling her body for the perfect shot. Darius, you present yourself as a self-made success, she continued, but let's talk about how your story is perceived. Some argue that black entrepreneurs receive an unfair advantage when it comes to media attention, that the narrative of overcoming struggle is more marketable than the thousands of white business owners who work just as hard but don't get the same headlines. Darius let out a quiet chuckle. Oh, so now we get too much attention. Madeline's polished smile didn't waver, but her posture shifted, just slightly. She hadn't expected him to laugh. You're telling me that in a world where 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men, he said, his tone sharp, deliberate, where major tech funding still overwhelmingly goes to white-owned startups, the real issue is that we get too much press? Madeline tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, regaining her composure. I'm just pointing out that in today's climate, some feel there's pressure to highlight diversity over pure merit. Darius exhaled, shaking his head. Merit. Right. He glanced at the cameras, just briefly, before turning his full attention back to her. Tell me something, Madeline, he said, his voice quieter now but no less powerful. Do you really think that if I wasn't exceptional at what I do, I'd be sitting in this chair right now? Her lips parted slightly. She had an answer ready, but before she could speak, he pressed on. You think I got here because I played the diversity card? Or do you think I got here despite everything designed to keep me out? The silence that followed was louder than anything she had said. Louder than any of her carefully crafted questions. But Madeline wasn't finished. Not yet. She had one last card to play. The one designed to break him. Madeline took a slow breath, shifting in her seat just enough to make it look casual. But Darius saw it, a crack in the facade. She glanced at her cue cards one last time, then set them down. This next part? She wanted to say directly. Darius, she said, tilting her head slightly, her voice soft but precise. I think it's fair to say you're passionate about this. And I respect that. But let me ask you something. Darius gave a slow nod, waiting. Do you think some of this outrage is exaggerated? She let the words settle, watching him. After all, she continued smoothly, your success story proves that the system isn't as stacked against black entrepreneurs as some claim. The audacity. Darius could feel the heat creeping up his spine, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he let out another quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You know. Darius exhaled, his voice steady, deliberate. It's funny, he said, eyes locked onto Madeline, how people love to use one success story as proof that a problem doesn't exist. Madeline's practiced smile stayed in place, but something in her eyes flickered, just for a second. Darius leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. Let me put it this way, he continued. If one person manages to climb out of a burning building, do you point at them and say, see? The fire wasn't that bad. Madeline opened her mouth as if to respond, then hesitated. Closed it. Darius didn't let up. The fact that I made it doesn't mean the system isn't broken, he said. It just means I had to fight twice as hard to get through it. The weight of his words settled over the set. Even the studio crew, usually a blur of movement, had stilled. Madeline adjusted in her seat, reaching for control. I understand your perspective, she said, her voice measured. Then, with a slight pivot toward the cameras, she shifted gears. That carefully neutral tone, the kind reserved for damage control. But let's talk about another side of this, she continued. Some might say your frustration isn't really about race, that it's more about resentment toward larger corporations. After all, you've publicly criticized big tech companies for not hiring more diverse executives. Darius tilted his head slightly. Resentment? No. He let the word hang before adding, accountability? Absolutely. A flicker of something crossed Madeline's face. She pressed her lips together for a beat, recalibrating. Then what do you say, she asked, to those who believe that in today's economy, success is based on hard work, not race? Darius inhaled slowly through his nose. Then he met her gaze. This is the moment, he said, his voice unwavering, where I say that people love to believe in fairy tales, when they're the ones benefiting from them. A ripple of silence washed over the room. The kind of silence that lingers. That sticks. But let's be real, Darius continued, his tone steady. Black entrepreneurs are still denied loans at twice the rate of white business owners. We still receive less than 2% of venture capital funding. And even when we prove ourselves, we still get asked whether we deserved our success. Madeline remained still, listening, but not necessarily hearing. So let's stop pretending the system isn't rigged, Darius said. His voice wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. Every word hit its mark. It is. And the only people who don't see it are the ones it works for. Pure. Heavy. Silence. The control room didn't cut to commercial. The producers didn't intervene. This wasn't just another interview. Madeline shifted again, just slightly, but now, for the first time, she looked uncomfortable. She opened her mouth, about to speak. But Darius wasn't finished. Because this was the moment that would send shockwaves across the country. Madeline cleared her throat, glancing briefly at the off-camera producers. But there was no rescue coming. She had walked into this. And now, she had to sit in it. Darius adjusted his watch, letting the silence breathe. Letting it stretch just long enough to make people squirm. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "You know what the real problem is?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but somehow heavier. Madeline hesitated. "What?" Darius didn't blink. "The bar," he said. "It isn't in the same place for everyone." She shifted again. "Meaning?" "I mean," Darius said, leaning forward just slightly, "a mediocre white man can fail upwards in this country, but a brilliant black man has to jump through flaming hoops just to get a shot." A producer off-camera cursed under their breath. They knew this was going viral. Darius wasn't done. "A white CEO," he continued, "can run a company into the ground, bankrupt it, lay off thousands of employees, and somehow, he gets hired somewhere else." Madeline started to speak. "But a black CEO?" Darius cut in. "One bad quarter, and suddenly, it's proof that we weren't ready for leadership." Madeline's lips parted slightly, as if to counter. But Darius was still going. "And the best part," he added, letting out a dry chuckle. "When we actually make it, people like you sit across from us and ask if we got here because of some special advantage." Silence. Madeline's jaw tightened, subtle, but the camera caught it. Darius leaned in, just slightly. Not aggressive. Just firm. Just final. "You wanted to talk about fairness?" he asked, voice low. He let out a soft, bitter chuckle. "Then let's start by telling the truth." The silence that followed wasn't just discomfort, it was something deeper. The weight of Darius's words had landed, and now, it wasn't just the studio watching. The entire country was paying attention. Then, he did something unexpected. He turned slightly, locking eyes with the camera. "I know what some of you are thinking," he said, his voice steady. "Some of you are nodding because you've lived this reality. And some of you're sitting there, arms crossed, telling yourself this isn't real. That I'm just playing victim. That this is all in my head." He let the words settle, his gaze unwavering. "But deep down," he continued, "you know I'm right." The studio was dead silent. No one moved. Then, the producer's voice crackled over the speakers. "All right, we need to take a quick break." Madeline forced a smile. "We'll be back with more after this." But the damage was already done. Within an hour, clips of the interview were everywhere. Social media exploded. Darius's words were being dissected, praised, and attacked from every angle. Darius Bell just exposed media bias on live TV. This was powerful. Truth hurts. The way he looked into the camera gave me chills. But not everyone saw it that way. Here we go again, another millionaire pretending to be oppressed. Cry me a river. This is why companies don't hire activists. Cable news picked it up. Some called him bold, others called him bitter. By lunchtime, the Morning Exchange released a carefully worded statement. "We value open discussions and diverse viewpoints. While today's conversation was more intense than expected, we remain committed to fair and open dialogue." Darius laughed when he read it. "Fair, huh?" His assistant, Tasha, called, half laughing, half exasperated. "Do you realize you just set the internet on fire?" "Wasn't exactly my plan." "Well, congrats. You're officially the most talked about entrepreneur in America." He didn't respond. He already knew what came next. Viral moments don't just fade. They ignite battles. And the next 48 hours? They were about to get messy. The story blew up beyond social media. News anchors debated it. Opinion pieces flooded major publications. Everyone had a take. Fox News: Is Darius Bell the new face of corporate entitlement? CNN: Darius Bell's viral moment. A reckoning for meritocracy. Business Insider: What his interview reveals about race and success in America. Meanwhile, Madeleine Royce was on damage control. The next morning, she addressed the controversy. "I respect Mr. Bell's accomplishments, but I stand by my questions," she said smoothly. "My job as a journalist is to ask what the audience is thinking. If my questions were uncomfortable, that only proves how necessary they were." Translation: She wasn't backing down. Darius watched from his office, shaking his head. Across from him, Tasha scrolled through emails. "You know," she said, "we just got a wave of new investor interest. People suddenly want to work with us." Darius smirked. "Let me guess, the same ones who ignored us last year?" Tasha shrugged. "Guess being controversial is good for business." But not all the attention was positive. Some clients pulled out. A major corporate partner suddenly needed to reevaluate their relationship. And then came the threats. Emails. Phone calls. An unmarked package left outside Innovis headquarters. Inside, just a single sheet of paper. One word written in bold. Enough. Tasha frowned. "You need security." Darius exhaled, rubbing his temples. He knew this was coming. Any time a black man spoke too boldly, too unapologetically, there was always a price. But he wasn't backing down. Now, he had a choice. He could let the backlash quiet him, let things blow over. Or, he could step fully into the conversation. The next morning, Tasha walked into his office with a folder in hand. "We just got an offer," she said. Darius raised an eyebrow. "From who?" She placed the folder on his desk. "A network. They want you to do a televised special. A deep dive on race, business, and the system." Darius exhaled. "So now they want to listen?" Tasha smirked. "Looks like it." She paused. "What do you want to do?" He leaned back, thinking. He could walk away. Get back to business. Or, he could take control of the narrative. Darius picked up the folder, flipping through the proposal. Then, he set it down and looked at Tasha. "Tell them I'll do it." Her eyes widened. "You sure?" He nodded. "Yeah. But on my terms." Because if they were going to put him under the spotlight, he was damn sure going to own the conversation. Darius Bell's viral moment wasn't just another internet controversy. It was a reckoning. A conversation America had been avoiding for too long. About race. About success. About who gets to rise without question, and who gets questioned when they rise. Some called him an activist. Some called him arrogant. Some called him right. But one thing was certain. Nobody could ignore him anymore. So what do you think? Does success mean playing by the rules of a broken system? Or does it mean rewriting the rules entirely? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe these stories need to be told, subscribe.